It's May 2nd, 2017. In the exclusive neighborhood of Anzures in Mexico City, an elite team from the Army and the Attorney General's office glides through the pre-dawn darkness towards a luxury apartment building. There are no shots fired, no violent confrontation. The target's door opens, and inside, a middle-aged man, visibly exhausted, is arrested without resistance. He's not a low-level hitman or a simple operator. He's a man who, for years, was the shadow, the right-hand man, and the compadre of the world's most famous drug trafficker. A man whose intelligence and knowledge of the system earned him the nickname El Licenciado, the graduate or the attorney. His name, Dámaso López Núñez. But who really was this man who went from being an official in the justice system to one of the pillars of the most powerful cartel on the planet? Was he a loyal strategist who helped build an empire from the shadows of a cell? Or a calculating opportunist whose final act of betrayal would define him forever? Was he the last vestige of the Sinaloa Cartel's old guard, or the architect of its bloodiest internal war? Join me as we delve into the origins of the man whose story is a labyrinth of loyalty, power, and the darkest of betrayals. The story of the man who dared to challenge the legacy of his own boss and friend, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. Loyalty has a price, and betrayal has a story. If you dare to know the truths hidden in the shadows of power, subscribe. What you're about to discover will change the way you see the game. Dámaso López Núñez's story begins not on the battlefields of the drug trade, but in the very cradle of the Sinaloa Cartel, the municipality of El Dorado. Born on February 22nd, 1966, Dámaso grew up in an environment where the lines between law and crime were porous, almost non-existent. Sinaloa, a state on Mexico's Pacific coast, has long been the epicenter of drug production and trafficking in the country. From the era of the first gomeros, the poppy growers, to the rise of the great kingpins, the region developed a unique culture, a narco culture, where the figure of the trafficker was often romanticized as a social bandit, a man of the people who challenged a corrupt and distant government. Growing up in El Dorado meant understanding this duality. Dámaso didn't come from the extreme poverty that pushed many into a life of crime, but he didn't belong to the elite either. His family was working class, and from a young age, Dámaso showed an intelligence and ambition that set him apart. Unlike many of his contemporaries who saw the drug trade as the only path to advancement, he chose a different route, one that seemed diametrically opposed: the law. He studied law and forged a career within government institutions. This path gave him invaluable knowledge, not about how to traffic drugs, but about how the system meant to combat it actually worked. He learned its weaknesses, its blind spots, and most importantly, its deep and endemic corruption. His career took him through various positions in Sinaloa's judicial and police systems, gradually rising thanks to his cunning and his ability to navigate turbulent waters. He became a prosecutor for the public ministry, a position that gave him a first-hand view of anti-drug investigations and how they could be manipulated, shelved, or simply ignored for the right price. It was this experience that earned him the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life. El Licenciado was an educated man, a man of laws in a world of gunmen, and that was his main strength. His career took a significant leap when he was transferred to the federal prison system. It was here in the heart of the Mexican state's punishment machinery that his destiny would become irreversibly intertwined with that of organized crime. His knowledge of the system not only made him a good official, but also a potentially priceless asset for those who lived outside the law. In the 1990s, Mexico faced an unprecedented security crisis. The big cartels, like the Guadalajara Cartel, had fragmented, giving rise to new and more violent organizations. The Sinaloa Cartel, led by emerging figures like Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán Loera and Ismael El Mayo Zambada, was beginning to consolidate its power. The government, in response, built maximum security prisons to house these new and powerful kingpins. One of these prisons, and perhaps the most infamous of all, was Federal Social Readaptation Center No. 2, better known as Puente Grande in Jalisco. It was known as the Big Gate for its supposed inviolability, but the reality was very different. It was in this setting, a microcosm of the corruption and power that plagued Mexico, where El Licenciado would be tested and make the decision that would change his life and the course of drug trafficking history. The Puente Grande prison was inaugurated in 1993 as the crown jewel of the Mexican penitentiary system, an impregnable fortress designed to contain the country's most dangerous criminals. However, behind its concrete walls and watchtowers, the reality was a farce. Corruption was the true law, and money was the key that opened every door. Dámaso López Núñez arrived at Puente Grande not as an inmate, but as part of its administration, rising to the position of Deputy Director of Security and Custody. His position gave him immense power over the lives of the inmates and control over the flow of information and goods in and out of the prison. He was the guardian of the golden cage, and he would soon meet its most illustrious prisoner. Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán was captured in Guatemala in 1993, and after a brief stay in another prison, was transferred to Puente Grande. From the moment he set foot in the prison, El Chapo behaved not like a prisoner, but like the real warden. With his immense fortune, he bought the loyalty of guards, commanders, and administrators. The prison became his personal palace, an operations center from which he continued to run the Sinaloa Cartel. Inside Puente Grande, El Chapo lived a life of absurd luxury. He had access to cell phones, televisions, alcohol, drugs, and even organized parties with prostitutes and live bands. The guards were not his custodians, but his employees. The other inmates were not his equals, but his subjects. It was in this environment of absolute power and total corruption that El Licenciado and El Chapo forged their relationship. Dámaso, as Deputy Director of Security, was in a unique position to facilitate the kingpin's lifestyle and, in return, receive a share of his immense wealth. What began as a relationship of convenience based on bribes and favors gradually transformed into a strategic alliance and, finally, a friendship. El Chapo saw in Dámaso a man of his own kind, intelligent, ambitious, and pragmatic. El Licenciado was not a simple sicario. He understood the system, spoke the language of lawyers and politicians, and possessed a calm and analytical ability that were rare in the violent world of drug trafficking. For his part, Dámaso saw in El Chapo not only a source of unlimited income, but a charismatic figure of power, a leader who had built an empire from nothing. Dámaso's loyalty was bought with millions of dollars, but it was also cemented by genuine respect and a growing affinity. By the year 2000, the relationship was so close that El Chapo no longer saw Dámaso as a corrupt official, but as one of his most trusted men. It was then that a new fear began to loom over the kingpin: extradition. The Supreme Court of Mexico had issued a ruling that made it easier to send drug traffickers to the United States, where El Chapo knew he would face relentless justice with no possibility of bribes or luxuries. The only option was to escape, and for that, he needed the help of someone who controlled the prison from the inside. He needed El Licenciado. Dámaso became the architect of what would be El Chapo's first great escape, an operation that would humiliate the Mexican government and solidify the kingpin's legend. For months, López Núñez worked meticulously, coordinating every detail. He used his authority to bribe or intimidate dozens of guards and officials. He ensured that the security cameras pointing at El Chapo's cell had blind spots. He organized the logistics so that a vehicle could wait for the kingpin outside the prison walls without being detected. The plan was as bold as it was simple. On the night of January 19, 2001, the operation was set in motion. A maintenance worker, Francisco El Chito Camberos, pushed a laundry cart through the prison corridors. Inside, hidden under dirty sheets, was Joaquin Guzman Loera. Thanks to Dámaso's planning, the cart passed through 8 security checkpoints without being searched. The doors opened. The guards looked the other way. Minutes later, El Chapo was in the trunk of a car driving away from Puente Grande. Dámaso López Núñez had accomplished his mission. He had freed the most wanted man in Mexico. In doing so, he had crossed a line from which there was no return. He resigned from his position at the prison shortly before the escape, disappearing from the public eye. He was no longer a government official. He was now a full-time, high-ranking member of the Sinaloa Cartel. His act of supreme loyalty had earned him a place in the innermost circle of power, a place he would hold for nearly 2 decades. He just crossed the line. On one side, the law. On the other, an empire. Behind every criminal empire are secrets worth more than gold. You already know where to find them. Subscribe, because the real darkness is just beginning. After the spectacular escape from Puente Grande, Dámaso López Núñez fully immersed himself in the structure of the Sinaloa Cartel. He was no longer an outside ally, but a central piece of the machinery. His transition from the world of law to the world of crime was complete. He became El Chapo's right-hand man, his counselor, and one of his main operators. His role, however, was not that of a chief of hitmen or a violent leader. His strength lay in his intelligence and his knowledge of the system. El Licenciado specialized in logistics and corruption, the 2 vital arteries that kept the cartel pumping thousands of tons of drugs northward. He used his former contacts in security agencies and the judicial system to create a vast network of protection. He knew who to bribe, who to pressure, and how to move shipments through territories controlled by police and the army without being detected. He became a master of money laundering, creating front companies and using complex financial schemes to legitimize the cartel's obscene profits. His strategic vision was fundamental to the expansion of the Sinaloa Cartel during the first decade of the 21st century. While other cartels like the Arellano Felix in Tijuana or the Gulf Cartel in the northeast bled themselves dry in brutal and public wars, the Sinaloa Cartel, under the guidance of El Chapo, El Mayo, and El Licenciado, opted for a more subtle strategy, a combination of selective violence and systemic corruption that allowed them to operate with unprecedented efficiency. The relationship between Dámaso and El Chapo transcended the professional. They became compadres, a nearly sacred bond in Mexican culture, established when one baptizes the other's child. El Chapo baptized one of Damaso's twin sons, sealing an alliance that was supposed to be unbreakable, a brotherhood forged in crime and mutual trust. This bond gave Dámaso a special status within the organization. He wasn't just an employee, he was family. This status allowed him to build his own faction within the cartel, known as Los Dámaso, or the Dámaso Special Forces. He had his own army of hitmen, his own trafficking routes, and his own corruption networks, all operating under the banner and with the blessing of the Sinaloa Cartel, an empire within an empire. During these years, Dámaso amassed a personal fortune estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars. He maintained a relatively low profile, unlike other kingpins who flaunted their wealth. El Licenciado preferred to operate from the shadows, pulling the strings, ensuring the criminal machinery never stopped working. His power and influence were immense, but always subordinate to the figure of his compadre, El Chapo. Meanwhile, Dámaso was grooming his successor, his own son, Dámaso López Serrano, known as El Minilic. Unlike his father, El Minilic embodied the new generation of narcos. He was impulsive, violent, and addicted to attention. He used social media to show off his extravagant lifestyle. Luxury cars, gold-plated weapons, parties with celebrities, and exotic animals. He was the antithesis of his father, the calculating and discreet strategist. This difference in styles would generate tensions in the future, but for the moment, El Minilic was seen as the natural heir to the power of the Dámaso faction. The balance of power within the cartel remained relatively stable for more than a decade. But everything began to change in February 2014, when El Chapo was captured for the second time in a condominium in Mazatlan. With the top leader behind bars, the cartel's command structure was altered. Ismael El Mayo Zambada, the historic co-leader, assumed a more prominent role, but so did other factions. El Chapo's sons, Ivan Arquivaldo and Jesus Alfredo, known as Los Chapitos, began to claim their father's throne. And of course, there was Dámaso López, the loyal compadre, the man who had proven his worth, and who now saw an opportunity to consolidate his power even further. El Chapo's escape from the Altiplano prison in July 2015 through a spectacular tunnel seemed to restore order for a brief time. However, his freedom was short-lived. In January 2016, he was recaptured. This time, the Mexican government, humiliated once again, accelerated his extradition process to the United States. With El Chapo definitively out of the game, the stage was set for a war of succession. Los Chapitos, young, arrogant, and with a legendary surname, believed the cartel belonged to them by birthright. El Licenciado, the veteran strategist, the man who knew all the organization's secrets, felt his experience and loyalty gave him the right to lead. The tension between the two factions, which had been simmering for years, was about to explode into an open and bloody conflict that would tear the Sinaloa Cartel apart from the inside and test the true nature of Dámaso López's loyalty. The extradition of Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán to the United States in January 2017 was the trigger that lit the fuse of the most devastating internal war in the history of the Sinaloa Cartel. The throne was empty, and two main factions launched a fight to the death to occupy it. On one side were Los Chapitos, Ivan Arquivaldo and Jesus Alfredo Guzmán. The blood heirs, raised in opulence and violence, felt their father's empire was their natural inheritance. They had the backing of a part of the old guard and, more importantly, the mythical aura of their surname. They were seen as the continuation of El Chapo's legacy. On the other side was Dámaso López Núñez, El Licenciado, and his son, El Minilik. Dámaso represented experience, strategy, and the connection to the corrupt power structures that had allowed the cartel to thrive. He felt betrayed by Los Chapitos, who, according to him, did not respect his track record or his compadre relationship with El Chapo. He believed the impulsiveness and arrogance of the young heirs would lead the cartel to ruin. The conflict erupted with unprecedented brutality. The streets of Culiacan and other parts of Sinaloa became a battlefield. Kidnappings, torture, and assassinations became daily occurrences. In February 2017, the violence reached a critical point when Los Chapitos and El Mayo Zambada were ambushed, allegedly by men loyal to El Licenciado. In a letter sent to the media, El Chapo's sons accused Dámaso of treason, claiming he had summoned them to a meeting only to try to assassinate them. Dámaso denied the accusations, counterattacking and accusing Los Chapitos of being the aggressors and of not respecting the organization's codes. The war was declared. The Dámaso faction launched an all-out offensive. El Minilik, flaunting his belligerent style, flooded social media with war propaganda, posting photos of his heavily armed sicarios and videos of convoys of armored trucks patrolling the streets. It was a war that was as much about media as it was about military might. However, El Licenciado had underestimated his adversaries. Los Chapitos not only had a powerful surname, but they also had a crucial ally. Ismael El Mayo Zambada, the old kingpin, the last of the cartel's founders still at large, finally decided to take a side. Seeing the Dámasos as a threat to the organization's stability, and perhaps calculating that his old partner's sons were the lesser evil, El Mayo threw the weight of his immense criminal machinery behind Los Chapitos. This decision was the beginning of the end for Dámaso López. Isolated and outmatched in numbers and firepower, his faction began to suffer significant defeats. Many of his operators and hitmen were killed or switched sides, swearing allegiance to Los Chapitos. The pressure became unbearable. As the war raged in Sinaloa, the Mexican government, in collaboration with U.S. intelligence agencies like the DEA, saw this internal conflict as a golden opportunity to dismantle the leadership of both factions. The hunt for Dámaso López intensified. Knowing he couldn't win the war in Sinaloa, El Licenciado made a fatal mistake. He fled to Mexico City, believing he could go unnoticed in the anonymity of the country's largest metropolis. But his enemies and the authorities were on his trail. His son, El Minilik, sensing the net was closing, made an unprecedented decision in the history of high-level drug trafficking. In July 2017, he crossed the border in Calexico, California, and voluntarily surrendered to U.S. authorities. It was an act of desperation, an admission of total defeat. He preferred a prison in the United States to certain death in Mexico at the hands of his rivals. His son's surrender was a devastating blow to El Licenciado. Not only had he lost his heir, but his position was now more precarious than ever. Mexican intelligence, with the help of the DEA, finally located his hideout. On May 2, 2017, in a surgical operation, he was arrested in his luxury apartment in the Anzures neighborhood. His capture was a trophy for the Mexican government and the end of an era for the Sinaloa Cartel. The internal war had left a clear winner: Los Chapitos, who, with the backing of El Mayo, consolidated their control over the empire. But Dámaso López's story wasn't over yet. In his cell, facing the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison and with his son in the hands of U.S. authorities, El Licenciado prepared for his final act, the most unexpected and controversial of all. The man who had based his career on loyalty to his compadre was about to become the biggest traitor in the cartel's history. The arrest of Dámaso López Núñez marked the end of his career as a drug trafficker, but the beginning of his final and most infamous chapter. Behind bars, El Licenciado found himself in a desperate position. His faction had been annihilated. His son was in U.S. custody, and he faced a long sentence in Mexico with the constant threat of extradition to the United States. For a man accustomed to power and control, the helplessness of his situation was overwhelming. It was then that his survival instincts and his calculating mind kicked in. He saw only one way out, one that involved breaking the most sacred code of the underworld: loyalty. He decided to cooperate with the very authorities he had fought for years. In July 2018, he was extradited to the United States, where he faced charges of drug trafficking and money laundering in the Western District of Virginia. His lawyers quickly began negotiating a deal with the prosecution. In exchange for a reduced sentence and possibly protection for him and his family, Dámaso López would offer the only valuable thing he had left: his secrets. He would become the star witness in the trial of the century, the case against his former boss, friend, and compadre, Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán. In January 2019, the world watched as El Licenciado took the stand in a Brooklyn, New York courtroom. For several days, his testimony was a bombshell that shook the foundations of the Sinaloa Cartel. With chilling calm, he recounted in lavish detail the story of his relationship with El Chapo, from their days in Puente Grande to the bloody war with Los Chapitos. He described El Chapo's first escape as an operation he himself coordinated, implicating dozens of corrupt officials. He narrated how El Chapo continued to run the cartel from prison, using his lawyers and his wife, Emma Coronel Aispuro, as messengers. His testimony was devastating, painting an intimate portrait of El Chapo not as a legend, but as a methodical and ruthless criminal leader. He detailed drug shipments, trafficking routes, money laundering methods, and, most shockingly, murders. He recounted how El Chapo personally ordered the torture and execution of rivals, including members of his own family who had betrayed him. One of the most dramatic moments of his testimony was when he described an episode where an enraged El Chapo murdered 3 members of a rival cartel. According to Dámaso, after interrogating them, El Chapo shot them in the head with a rifle and ordered their bodies to be thrown into a bonfire. The description was so graphic it left the courtroom in silence. The betrayal was total and absolute. He not only implicated his compadre in countless crimes, but also snitched on other members of the organization, including Emma Coronel herself, whom he accused of helping coordinate El Chapo's second escape in 2015. Throughout his testimony, El Chapo watched him from the defense table, impassive. The 2 men, who were once vow compadres, who shared secrets and power, were now separated by an abyss of betrayal. For the world of drug trafficking, Dámaso's act was the ultimate dishonor. In narco culture, where loyalty is a supreme value, testifying against a partner, and even more so against a compadre, is a cardinal sin. He became a pariah, a snitch, erasing with his testimony any legacy of power or respect he might have had. The testimony of El Licenciado, along with that of other cooperators, was crucial in sealing El Chapo's fate. In February 2019, Joaquin Guzman Loera was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to life in prison, plus 30 years in a maximum security U.S. prison. The legend had fallen, thanks in large part to the betrayal of his most trusted man. For his cooperation, Dámaso López Núñez received a considerably reduced sentence. In 2020, he was sentenced to life, but thanks to his collaboration, it was expected to be reviewed and lowered. His son, El Minilek, also cooperated and received a lighter sentence. Both likely entered the witness protection program, disappearing forever with new identities, living with the constant fear that the long arm of the cartel might one day find them to exact revenge for their betrayal. The story of Dámaso López is a Greek tragedy in the world of narcos, a parable of how ambition and the instinct for survival can destroy the most sacred bonds. He went from being the loyal architect of a legendary escape to the traitor who helped lock his own compadre away forever. His legacy is not that of a powerful kingpin, but of a man who, in the end, chose to save himself at the cost of everything and everyone he once swore to protect. In the end, the story of Dámaso López Núñez forces a reflection on the nature of power and loyalty in a world without rules. Was El Licenciado a traitor by nature, a man who was always waiting for the right moment to rise, even if it meant destroying his benefactor? Or was he simply a product of a brutal system, a player who, upon finding himself cornered with no moves left, decided to knock over the board to save his own life? His journey mirrors the evolution of the Sinaloa Cartel itself. It began as an organization with codes of honor, where one's word and the bond of compadrazgo held real weight. Dámaso thrived under that system, earning El Chapo's trust through an act of unprecedented loyalty. However, as the cartel grew into a multi-billion-dollar global enterprise and the internal and external pressures mounted, those codes became fragile. The new generation, represented by Los Chapitos and his own son, El Minilek, operated under a different logic, more impulsive and less respectful of the old hierarchies. The internal war that bled the cartel dry wasn't just over roots and money. It was a generational clash, a conflict between the old guard and the new princes. In this new and chaotic scenario, Dámaso's loyalty was tested, and it broke. By choosing to confront his compadre's sons, he broke a family bond. And by testifying against El Chapo, he annihilated the last vestige of his own past. Dámaso's intelligence cannot be denied. He was a brilliant strategist, a man who understood the entrails of power, both of the state and of crime. His ability to operate in both worlds made him indispensable to El Chapo and allowed him to build a formidable power base. But that same intelligence, that calculating mind, was what ultimately led him to commit the final act of betrayal. He assessed his options and coolly concluded that his only chance of survival was to snitch. His legacy, therefore, is immensely complex. For the authorities, he was an invaluable tool that helped dismantle the leadership of the world's most powerful criminal organization and bring its legendary leader to justice. For the Sinaloa Cartel and the underworld, his name became synonymous with the worst betrayal imaginable. A warning that in the drug game, there are no friends or compadres, only temporary interests and a constant struggle for survival. And for history, Dámaso López Núñez, El Licenciado, will be remembered as the man who knew all the king's secrets and used them to destroy him. A modern-day Iago in the bloody theater of the Mexican drug trade. So, after journeying through the labyrinth of his life, from the corridors of a corrupt prison to the witness stand in New York, the final question remains. Was Dámaso López a loyal compadre, corrupted by ambition and desperation? Or was he always a cunning opportunist who saw loyalty as a simple tool for advancement? A tool he didn't hesitate to discard when it was no longer useful. The official story always has two sides. We show you the one that power wants to hide. If you are captivated by these chronicles of broken loyalty and unbridled ambition, subscribe. What comes next is even darker.